No. Good afternoon, Ms Barami.
Good afternoon, my lord. Our next panel is a panel on religious observance. The members are Mr Omar Afzal from the Scottish Association of Mosques, Mr Michael Hutchinson from the Quakers in Scotland, and the Reverend Dr George White from the Church of Scotland.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Thank you. Right, when you're ready, Ms Barami.
Thank you, my lord. Mr Afzal, this is your second session giving evidence this week, and His Lordship has already had the benefit of hearing a description of your organisation and role, so I won't ask you to repeat that. And you've also confirmed that you did provide a statement to the inquiry. Thank you. Mr Hutchison and Dr White, you each also provided a statement to the inquiry. Mr Hutchinson, the reference number for your statement is SCI WT 0601501. Dr White, the reference number for your statement is SCI WT 0876501. Could we start with Mr Hutchinson and Dr White, with Mr Hutchinson first? Would you please tell His Lordship about your organisation, the community you serve, your background and role within the organisation, both now and during the pandemic, if it was different?
Michael Hutchinson. I'm the presiding clerk of Quakers in Scotland, which is a 3-year role, as Quakers don't have a formal hierarchy. We take turns in doing that. Quakers are an organisation that started in the Civil War period in England, and we're a fairly small group of only about 1,300 in Scotland. During the pandemic, I was the presiding clerk of one of our 4 districts, which was West Scotland, and so I was involved in trying to help the community of about 12 Quaker meetings, or separate churches you might call them, during that time. My background is that I was assistant recording clerk of Britain Yearly Meeting, which translated means the deputy CEO, based in London at Friends House, opposite Euston Station. And therefore I have some background knowledge of Quaker governance, which I used to advise on.
Thank you. Dr White, I wonder if you might do the same, please.
Yes, George White. I'm retired 2 days ago for the second time.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm a minister in the Church of Scotland, which, as you probably know, is a church established in the 16th century with a territorial view of Scotland run through parishes. I was the principal clerk of its General Assembly. Its decision-making is Presbyterian. It's run by courts nationally, regionally and locally, so General Assembly, Presbytery and Kirk Session. I was, at the time of the COVID pandemic, the principal clerk of our General Assembly, and therefore was charged in those times with the coordination of the Church of Scotland's response to the COVID pandemic and the relationship of the Church of Scotland regarding pandemic matters and the Scottish Government. And I took part in the Christian leaders and the faith leaders side of that, and inputted to the representatives group, which did more things about technical, detailed regulation. At the time of the pandemic, we would be working with 1,200 parish churches across Scotland, with an adult membership of just about 250,000 people, plus obviously families and all those who used their premises. I think probably at that time we would provide the majority of community space in Scotland through church halls and so on. and therefore dealt with a big range of users, both from our own organisations, charitable things and straightforward commercial lets, things like Keep Fit. So we had a variety of users as tenants and people we interacted with in terms of regulation and varied use and varied permissions therefore. So I saw that through the pandemic process, retired as Principal Clerk in 2022, and for the last nearly couple of years I've been looking after St Giles Cathedral.
Thank you. Now, before going further, I just want to remind you that the proceedings are being transcribed today, so please try to speak slowly and clearly as you have been doing, and try not to speak over each other, which I'm sure you wouldn't do deliberately anyway. Also to remind you that there is a restriction order in place, so please don't mention the names of any private individuals while you're giving your evidence. Thank you. So I'd like to start with by asking you some questions on changes to worship during the pandemic before asking you about the impact of those changes on officials within your faith and the followers. So, and I will start with Mr. Afzal. Please, would you start by telling us about the way in which members of your faith typically participate in worship in your religious buildings, and about the decision to suspend in-person worship, whether that was taken before lockdown was announced or at the point that it was announced?
Sure. Just for way of background, in the last session I talked a little bit about our core beliefs.
Yeah.
Alongside our core beliefs, we've got our core practices as well, which is more commonly known as the 5 pillars of Islam. And they just briefly are the testimony of faith, the Shahada. The second one is the Salah, which is the 5 times daily prayer. The third one is the Zakat, which is our charitable giving a portion of your wealth in charity. The fourth, the other one is our fasting in the holy month of Ramadan, Saum, and the final one is our pilgrimage, the Hajj, which you would perform once in your life. In terms of our worship at mosques, it's obligatory for men to pray in the mosque unless there's a good reason not to. So mosques are quite well used. We have the 5 times daily congregational prayer. So that's a kind of a dawn prayer, an afternoon prayer, a late afternoon prayer, a sunset prayer and an evening prayer. So over the course of the day there'll always be a congregational prayer at those times, and members of the community would come for those congregational prayers. On the Friday we have our main prayer of the week called the Jummah prayer, which replaces the midday prayer on the Friday. On the midday prayer there's also a sermon as well, so the Imam would deliver a sermon, and he would also deliver he'd also then lead the prayer. The way a Friday service would typically work in a mosque in Scotland would be, first of all, the Imam, the religious leader of the building, he would give a lecture in English. He would then deliver the sermon in Arabic, and he would then lead the congregational prayer. The prayer within the Islamic tradition is a physical prayer. It involves standing, it involves bowing, and it involves prostration as well. Within the congregational prayer, the way we arrange the congregation is that the Imam is at the front of the hall, the prayer hall, and the Imam leads the congregation whilst facing in the direction of the first house of worship, the Kaaba, in the holy city of Mecca. Behind the Imam then, the rest of the congregation would stand shoulder to shoulder in a straight line, and then once that line is full, another line would start, and the congregation would be shoulder to shoulder, and so on and so on. And that's how the lines of the congregation would be arranged in the mosque. Alongside our congregational prayer, there's also quite a significant teaching and learning programme that goes on in the mosque as well. So children from as young as 5 would come along to the mosque for religious instruction classes, and some mosques would offer quite advanced courses as well for adults. So that's a big part of what we do at the mosque as well. During the month of Ramadan, we would also have extra nighttime prayers as well. So in the month of Ramadan, we would be fasting from pre-dawn to sunset. At sunset, when it's time for breaking the fast, there would normally be a meal called the iftar. Mosques across the country would generally offer the iftar, either just a breaking of the fast in the tradition of the Prophet, which would be with dates and water, or they would offer a full meal as well. So that would happen in Ramadan, and then in the evenings there would be nighttime prayers called the Tarawih prayers. Over the course of the month of Ramadan, the entirety of the Quran would be recited in the Tarawih prayers over the course of that month. When it came to the pandemic, I described in my written testimony that it was watching a wave coming to shore, essentially. We saw how COVID started in the Far East and it was moving its way across the world. Before our congregational prayer, there's a call to prayer called the Adhan, which if you've travelled to the Middle East, you may have heard on loudspeakers. And part of the call to prayer is a phrase where the muezzin, the person giving the call to prayer, he says, come to prayer. When the pandemic struck in the Middle East, that phrase was changed to pray wherever you are or pray at home. And I think here in the UK, when we saw the videos of that being broadcast in the Middle East, that's when it really started to hit home that this is serious, and we're going to have to start to look at what we're doing here as well. And I don't think there was a dry eye when you saw that you know the mosques are telling people to pray at home. So that's really when the conversations started within the community about what do we do. We then started to get some small cases of COVID within the UK. There was then the call from the Scottish Government to restrict large gatherings of 500 and more. And that's when really mosques came together and started to discuss what our plan was to respond to the pandemic. Initially, the organisation that I was with at the time was the Muslim Council of Scotland, which was a broad umbrella body of mosques and madrasas and Muslim organisations in Scotland. Through the Muslim Council of Scotland, we'd convened a meeting of the most influential mosques in the country, which covered across a range of denominations. First of all, it was the organisational structure side of the mosques that met, so it was the committees and the trustees, etc., and they discussed what the plan of action would be. After that, then it was a committee of imams who sat. It was the most senior imams in the west of Scotland at the time, and de facto they were the most senior imams in the country, actually. And at the end of that meeting, there was a decision to close the mosques from the 19th of May. There was a statement that was released by those imams. There's 9 imams who signed that statement. Amongst them was the most senior imam in Scotland at the time, the Imam Akhtar of the Madrasa Talim al-Islam in Pollokshields in Glasgow. That statement then was the basis.
I'm sorry, there's been a breach of the restriction order.
Yeah.
Is that actually a breach? It's a recognised public office, is it not? It's not someone who has been mentioned in a personal capacity. It has been mentioned in his official capacity. I think that's a fair. Is that? I'll be guided by you, obviously, Mr. Alves, but I think that's a fair representation.
Yeah, he was an imam, and he was considered the most senior imam in the country at the time.
And his name would be no doubt publicly published in the mosques' papers and things like that.
Possibly. Yeah.
We can excise the name easily, there's no worry.
My Lord, my apologies if you'd allow me a moment just to check the redaction.
Absolutely. Yeah. I simply suspect it's probably not hugely important, to be perfectly honest, and that's no disrespect to the man. Far from it.
Yeah. Trust me to go off this.
You don't need to worry, it happens.
My Lord, I think your Lordship is correct that he is mentioned in his professional capacity, and the fact that he has signed a document is within the public domain.
Yeah.
So I don't think a breach has occurred.
You're quite right to draw it to my attention, but I think it's my procedure. I'll make a formal ruling so that you're protected,
Thank you.
and we can proceed.
Thank you. Mr. Afzal, I wonder if I might just check something though before you continue your answer. You mentioned that the mosques closed from the 19th of May. Should that have been the 19th of March?
19th of March, apologies. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, 19th of March. So from the 19th of March, that statement was released on the 18th of March, and from the 19th of March then those mosques closed for congregational prayer, and also including the Friday Jummah prayer as well. That document then provided the basis for other mosques to follow suit as well. Prior to that, a couple of mosques had closed temporarily for a deep clean because members of the congregation had suspected cases of COVID. So there was already, imams who had taken that decision based on the circumstances at the time. So mosques were taking the pandemic and the issue of COVID extremely seriously, as were other faith leaders. I think it was disappointing though that wasn't recognised, maybe particularly amongst the members of the Scottish Government, because we had received a letter from the Chief Medical Officer, co-signed by the Cabinet Secretary for Justice, which was addressed to imams and sent to mosques, urging us to close. We were already quite significantly along that road of discussing what our response was going to be, and we'd already kind of pretty much taken the decision that closing was the most appropriate thing to do. That letter went only to mosques. It went only to imams. It didn't go to any other faith group, as far as I'm aware. Okay. If it's the case that it did only go to mosques, then I would have to say it's a textbook case of institutional Islamophobia, where Muslims are seen as a group of people who have to separately be told that there's something very serious going on, and separately be asked to take some action, when in fact the opposite was the case.
Thank you. Mr. Hutchinson, I wonder whether you might tell us, answer the same question, please.
Thank you. There are 34 worshipping communities in Scotland, Quaker meetings, of which about 7 own property, the rest hire venues. Quaker worship takes the form of a silent assembly, usually in a circle. We have elders who look after the running of the worship but aren't in charge of it. And the purpose of the worship is to try, within the silence, to wait for a feeling of being gathered together and possibly stimulus to speak, although a worship may be entirely silent for an hour. The point about Quaker worship is that it can take place anywhere, but it is communal. And the point is to meet together. So when the pandemic started coming, we saw what was coming and got together with the presiding clerks of the different meetings within Scotland, and our structures were very good at allowing communication and backup and advice between us, and we also had backup and advice from our central offices in London. So when the request to stop worshipping in public came, it's something that we could foresee and also deal with on the whole. It did cause some distress, obviously, but it was fairly easy for us because we had already, being a dispersed community over quite large distances, invested first of all in telephone conferencing and also with Zoom video conferencing before the pandemic started. So we rolled out the video conferencing fairly quickly, and if local communities didn't have that resource, they could go into wider worship online, and that's basically what happened. There were some left out, but very few on the whole. It didn't suit us perfectly, but it did allow the communities to function together.
Thank you. Dr. White, could you do the same, please?
Yeah, Church of Scotland worship typically is a service on a Sunday morning. It involves hymn singing, which is the congregation's way of participating in worship, and clearly hymn singing was one of the losses in closing. The challenge for us in some ways was decision making. We have a local body called the Kirk Session that decides when times of services occur. We have a regional body which decides where services will occur, and there's a national body which has really nothing to do with where services happen at all, other than resourcing. So we had a fairly disparate group in which there is no clear authority figure. There is not a bishop or an archbishop to say things. When lockdown came along for us, clearly closing seemed to us a fairly straightforward thing we had to do. How to achieve it was a matter of just, I suppose, for us internally, taking a chance that we would just assume authority. And we would write to all our churches and say, as lockdown came in, that from this Sunday, all churches in the Church of Scotland will cease to meet for worship, and that their buildings will be closed to public access, with all the repercussions that went beyond that. I suppose I'm pleased to say that people saw the sense of what was being done, and this ad hocery, which we came up with, managed to coordinate a universal closure of our churches. So for a church which is used to gathering, and we would expect to see on a Sunday at that time 1 in 3, 1 in 4 of our active members attend a service. Obviously more attend over a period of 6 or 8 weeks. But for a church whose main worship act is hymn singing and sermon hearing and praying together, clearly lockdown had repercussions, which I'm sure you're coming to in time.
Yes, thank you. Yes, that is my next question. How did members of your faith worship during the lockdown phases of the pandemic? Did you provide online worship services? And if we could start with you, Mr. Hutchinson.
Yes, as I said, that we moved almost entirely to servicing the community through video conferencing, both in terms of the meeting for worship, the normal service, and also in our business meetings, which are also seen as worship opportunities. And there are disadvantages through video conferencing, but in fact we found there are a lot of advantages too. And it brought together Quakers from across Scotland much more strongly, and further afield, because there was worship opportunities through the Quaker College in Birmingham, and many worldwide, which a lot of us joined in with. So there were some friends left out, friends being term for Quaker, and our pastoral care teams tried to make sure they were in touch with them through phone if they hadn't got digital access. The worship continues in that way, hybrid, because we've learned from the pandemic to use it much more usefully. It has some disadvantages and some friends don't like it, but nonetheless it provided a strength of community which really helped us during that period.
Thank you. Right, Dr. White.
We had begun to use video technology in the central office in meetings. Presbyterianism is a form of Christianity which depends on people meeting in committees, I would say. It's almost born of mistrust of individuals, but I shouldn't say that in a public setting, obviously. The main point for us is we had a big range of congregations. So a congregation of 6 people in the Shetland Islands had a very different dynamic than the one in a big church in suburban Glasgow. The big churches, the churches with strength and people to do it, moved fairly quickly towards some form of online worship, either live, streamed, or creating videos which people could get and access that way. We started to find ways of using copyright, shared resource in terms of music, which was not completely straightforward. And what was, I suppose, also interesting for us is that in a church which is territorial, where people came to the church in their place, suddenly they could go to the church in other places. And there was a blurring of these parish lines, which was new to us. So there was within the Church of Scotland a range of options: live broadcast, recorded broadcast services, services on audio, people who printed what they were going to do in the service and distributed it until somebody thought that might be a way of transmitting the virus. I don't think it probably was, but that was stopped. So a range of ways of working people developed locally, and then gradually in the months that followed, a way of sharing resource, good practice, ideas, technical expertise and good advice, the purchase of equipment and so on, which set us on a way of working which we still have to some extent, so that you would find churches who have now got hybrid forms of worship. It's often extra work. It means that some people don't come together. It has lowered attendance in church services. And clearly in most setups, people don't see those who are online. Some churches have re-equipped themselves where the Zoom congregation can be seen, and the people in Zoom can see the live congregation, but they are few and far between. So a range of responses, adaptation, and generally not what we were used to. And of course, if hymn singing is your big thing, singing online is really an impossibility. And I think that did diminish people's religious experience, and for their cultural roots, that was something that was greatly missed within it. But we did. It's all right listening to other people singing, but if you're not singing yourself.
Thank you. And Mr. Afzal.
So there'd been a kind of tradition of broadcasting the call to prayer, and certainly in Glasgow since the 1990s. That was over UHF, which was the technology at the time. So there was some form of broadcast since then, and then different programmes that would happen in the mosque, whether it's lectures and things or events, they would be broadcast through UHF as well. So that kind of was already there in some of the communities. Moving after the places of worship closed, moving to online services, it didn't really make much of a difference for Muslim communities, because our requirement is to gather and to stand shoulder to shoulder and to be in the same congregation. So essentially we would have to be in the same room in order to have a congregational prayer. So although broadcasting the acts of worship was important because it gave people comfort to be able to see prayers were still happening in their local mosque, or to see the familiarity of their local mosque, that was important. It didn't solve the question of congregational prayers. People in their own homes would have small congregations between family members. You also had a situation with Ramadan as well, and as I mentioned earlier, the evening prayers, where over the course of the month the entirety of the Quran would be recited in congregational prayer. If you're not a terribly practicing Muslim, or if you struggle with reading Arabic and things, it's an important part of your Ramadan observance, is being able to take part in a service where the whole of the Quran was broadcast. So some of the mosques, some of the imams were broadcasting themselves, doing the Tarawih prayer, so that people could still tune in and maybe listen in and see it happening, but not actually actively take part. So that had a profound effect in our communities, particularly many of the elders who, for the entirety of their adult life, they've only ever prayed in congregational prayer. All of a sudden they're being denied the opportunity to do that, and there was a great sense of loss and a great sense of grief amongst communities that they couldn't do that. on the imams as well, the religious leaders, and for those who had to take that decision to close the mosques. There was a great it was a great feeling of guilt, actually. It was almost like a betrayal of our communities that, you know, we couldn't let them come to the mosque, especially in a time of crisis, a time of need like COVID, where prayers are incredibly important because of the blessings that they bring to communities, but also that idea again of, you know, supporting one another through the communal acts of worship and just seeing other people. And for some of our elders coming to the mosque, it may well have been their only social interaction of the day. So that social aspect of coming to prayers, the act of it being a religious obligation as well, from the point of view of communities as well, and the support the mosques offer to communities through just the sheer act of coming to the mosque, maybe even being in a warm space compared to, you know, not being able to heat your home, that kind of thing. That was all lost to the communities, and whilst broadcasting acts of worship did provide some comfort, it certainly didn't. It couldn't substitute praying in congregation.
Thank you. And that's on to my next question. Actually, I wanted to ask: do officials in your faith feel a moral duty to keep their religious buildings open to followers? And if so, what was the impact on them of closing buildings? Mr. Hutchinson, I appreciate that might have less of a relevance to the Quakers in Scotland, but I'll come to you as well on that question. But if I could start with you, Dr. White.
I think our general feeling was that there was no choice but to close. And therefore we didn't really agonise over the morality of it. The balance seemed to us to fall on the side of, this is an unknown disease, it's killing thousands of people, we must keep our people safe first up. That was the question, and we closed and then dealt with the consequences. But there was no great weeping, wailing, gnashing of teeth in a guilt sense. We did what we felt was right.
Yes.
We felt we had no choice in it, and then having done it, what do we do now is the question. I think none of us foresaw how it would feel, and I think none of us really ever will understand completely all that the damage was done. But at the start of it, safety was the big thing. We closed.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Afzal, I wonder if you'd like to expand on your answer, or...
Sure. Very similar to my friend, the Honourable Dr. White. We made decisions based on the information we had at the time, the best available information we had at the time. There was precedence within our religious law, within our Sharia, for closing mosques where there is extreme weather, for example, or where there is extreme circumstances such as COVID. But despite having that available to us, there was still that feeling of some form of betrayal. If you think of how the religion's reached us, and what it's been through to get to us, it's almost like a baton that's handed down from generation to generation. And for myself, I mean, I've been involved in mosque leadership or community representation from my teen years, actually. So my entire adult life has been centred around, mosques, making mosques more resourceful, reaching out to communities, getting people into the mosques, having services at the mosques. And it almost felt as though you dropped that baton that had been passed to you by the generations by closing the mosques. And I fully did take on board the point that my honourable friend made about, it was the only thing we could do at the time because of what was in front of us. But I think that sense of guilt and maybe even one day having to answer for that, I think it weighs quite heavily on a person.
Thank you. And Mr. Hutchinson.
We had a very similar experience. Quakers have a testimony to support the state as much as we can, unless, of course, we disagree with it. But the effect of closure wasn't directly very much of a problem on what you might call officials, because we don't have very many of those. what it did have was effects on different communities. The moral problem was much more to do with how you keep your community going without being able to attend a place of worship. Many of the hired venues, for example, were closed for us. We didn't have any choice about not using them and all the rest of it. And I certainly noticed that where there was a weakness in the community, then they had greater difficulty in dealing with the closure compared to those that were resilient, where they adapted very well. But overall, we try to help the weaker communities by bringing them in. Where the most moral problem was where we did have our own properties and used them for letting, and often had live-in wardens or others. And they had the greatest difficulty because of some of them were on furlough but lived in the building. Matters like that preoccupied us more than actually worrying about the place of worship in itself, because we had other ways of worship.
Thank you. I want to move on to the impact on your congregations, your followers. Firstly, I'd like to focus on holy days or periods which took place in the early days of the pandemic. Mr. Afzal, you've mentioned Ramadan. I'm also thinking of Lent and Easter, other holy events that took place early on during the initial stages. How did observance differ to the traditional manner of observance, and what impact did that have on the followers of the faith? And if we could start with you, Mr. Afzal.
Sure. So the main religious events that we have within the Islamic faith are Ramadan and Eid. So there's two Eids. One is the Eid at the end of Ramadan, and the other one is the Eid at the end of the pilgrimage, and during the pilgrimage season. So during Ramadan, as I mentioned, we fast from pre-dawn till sunset, and then there's the iftar meal at sunset. Most of the mosques would offer very simple dates and water in the tradition of the Prophet with which to break your fast. Others would offer full meals. For some of our communities, for some of our community members, that meal is probably their only meal of the day. So it holds extra importance, and you can see with the location of certain mosques where they are in areas of high deprivation, where they're providing that meal, that they're very busy. In some of those mosques, they'd be providing hundreds of meals a day over the course of Ramadan. That can happen. So there was issues of how people could then access food as well. Many mosques were delivering thousands of meals a week, cooking and distributing thousands of meals a week over the course of the pandemic. But there's issues around how people could access that as well. In particular, students, international students, refugees as well. And the fact that refugees were essentially herded into these hotels, and they're provided meals which aren't culturally appropriate, for example. These were all impacts that were felt during Ramadan. In Eid, we have an Eid prayer in the morning, and to deal with the numbers that come for the Eid prayer, most mosques would have multiple Eid congregational times. To give you an example, Glasgow Central Mosque, the largest mosque in Scotland, this Eid that's just passed recently, their congregational numbers over the course of the Eid morning was in the region of about 12,000 over the course of 4 separate congregational prayers. So the numbers are quite significant. To use a phrase from where I'm from in the country, the mosques are always heaving when it comes to Eid. That couldn't happen either. In terms of how we got around that, the Muslim Council of Scotland, the organisation I was with at the time of COVID and who led the COVID response, we'd organised something called the Big Iftar online, which is with a Muslim paramedic, members of Parliament and other notables from the community, and there was this online iftar where people could share food at the time of breaking the fast, but not necessarily be in the same vicinity, and that was actually something that families did over the course of Ramadan during the pandemic, where families would probably come together for that meal online, and that's how they would then kind of mitigate not being able to actually meet together, and they would break their fast that way. So that's kind of roughly how Ramadan would work. There's other traditions within our communities. There's the Sufis who have gatherings where people would come together and communally they would chant loudly. They would recite the Quran loudly as well. And there's the four main orders of Sufism, and none of those could happen either. So again, those moved online. People were doing that online. There were and within the Shia community, they have gatherings when it comes to the month of Muharram. So for the first 10 days of Muharram, there's gatherings within the Shia community. Those gatherings couldn't happen either. And then there's a parade that the Shia community has as well, and again that parade couldn't happen either. So the effects that lockdown had on significant events within the religious calendar, I think, were quite profound. And for communities who, for whom these are core to their identity as humans, not just actually an observance or a transactional act, it was really difficult for them to come to terms with.
Thank you. And Mr. Hutchinson.
Quakers, of course, don't have specific holy days, or for that matter places, because each day and place is equally holy, if you use that term. And so therefore the question wasn't really relevant to us in that sense. It was really about focusing on the ability to worship on any day, particularly Sunday. However, the Quaker community gains its strength from meeting together and seeing each other's faces, and that's really important, and not having the ability to do all the things you do outside the formal worship, talking to people over coffee, checking up on people, that was more difficult, and we had to adapt. And we also lost the ability to meet for our business meetings. For example, I'm the clerk of General Meeting for Scotland, which meets 4 times a year in different cities. And that wasn't possible. We also try, and we get about 10% of all Quakers going every year to what we call a yearly meeting. And for the first time in 350 years, we weren't able to hold that in 2020. But we did hold it online. And we had 1,400 people on Zoom, which was quite an achievement. Of course, you can't see everyone. But nonetheless, we knew each other sufficiently for that to be able to work over a short period. So, again, we were adaptable primarily because of the availability of video conferencing. If we hadn't had that, it would have been a very, very different picture. And that was a lesson for us.
Thank you. Thank you. And Dr. White?
Lockdown started about 3 weeks before Easter. And clearly for the Church of Scotland, Easter is the big celebration of the heart of our faith. Sometimes I think we get a bit swamped at Christmas, but Easter is a very core thing, and people would have in place plans for Easter communion services, Holy Week services leading up to Easter. I don't think Lent is a big thing in the Church of Scotland, but for individuals it had less impact on that. So Easter would be planned, school assemblies, end of term stuff would be planned, and all of that was completely cut out immediately and just cancelled, and we were not agile enough or adept enough, I think, at that stage to do much about it. So we lost Easter by and large. The next, if not holy thing, important thing in the Church of Scotland is the General Assembly in May. We have an annual meeting, which is a national meeting, makes decisions for the whole church, but it also, for instance, elects a moderator to chair it. It's a gathered decision-making process. We had no rules in place for anything other than personal meetings. And so we had to, I was going to say, pull together a means of making the interim, the small, the institutional decisions that had to be made by really people not objecting to them. So we came up with that. Later on in years after, we've developed hybrid systems, but at that time we just had to make something up. And of course we couldn't have the meetings to authorise the making up. So there was a kind of catch-22 thing that you can't meet to decide what you do when you can't meet. And so it was built on trust and goodwill. And people went along with it because I think they saw the need to do so. So we lost Easter, and our decision-making processes were fundamentally challenged. They've been adapted since, but certainly in those early days it was quite a challenge.
Thank you. I'd like to move on now to the return to in-person worship and the need for social distancing. Can you tell us about the steps your organisation took to facilitate the return to in-person worshipping while adhering to the guidelines, and what socialising between members might have looked like in those early days? Whether you had to make use of booking processes to ensure you didn't exceed your capacities, and how long it took for things to return to normal, if they ever did. I understand, Mr. Hutchison, you've already alluded to the fact that you've actually learned from that and integrated practices, but if you could comment on those points, please, and if we could start with you, Mr. Hutchison.
We were blessed by our organisation helping us in this. We had a long series of comments from the staff at Friends House in London, and also our own trustees, who were very good at giving us advice, building on the advice of the Scottish Government in both cases. And that really was a great relief. So one or two meetings couldn't re-meet because their venues still wouldn't be open, and that caused some minor problems. But generally, we did adapt fairly well in advance. We kept to social distancing. We did all the things advised in terms of safeguarding and security, and making sure that people moved in certain ways. We painted things on the floors and all the rest of it. And that worked quite well. But it did have its limitations. For example, Glasgow, which is my own meeting, normally had up to 60 on a Sunday in the room. We only had 15 available when lockdown first stopped to allow public worship again. And what we did was have a booking system as far as we could. Trying to get Quakers to do anything altogether is like trying to herd a bunch of anarchists. But generally speaking, that worked very well. For example, I didn't go in person because we reserved those who were able to meet together, for those who were least able to join in with digital worship, or had other reasons for needing physical support of each other. So I didn't go for quite some time. When it did become less for the problem of having numbers in the room and all the rest of it, then we took about 2 years to get back to normal, inverted commas. There were a lot of friends who were very worried about being in public with others in a small space. And therefore, we started off when we could all go back. Only 50% were there in person. The other 50% were online, because by that time we had a big screen in the room and they came that way. Now, for example, we have 95% in the room and a few online who are either ill or physically away. So it did take quite some time to get back to feeling secure enough for everyone to worship together.
Thank you. Dr. White?
I think going back to church was harder than stopping organisationally. Clearly, the range of congregations we were dealing with was a challenge, and our ability to resource varying regulations as numbers and rules changed, and also the scale of congregations which may go from 1,200 members down to 20 members, each with a supposedly the same governance structure. I think by that time we had a better conversation with the government and the civil servants about how things should be expressed. We still had the great frustration that things came out on a Friday, which is clearly no use for religious communities. I think the Welsh learned to do Mondays. We struggled with the UK-wide coordination. It seemed to many of us in the devolved areas who spoke to each other that the English version took little cognizance of the fact that their public statements confused things, terminology, different rules south of the border from here. There was an issue in that which governments should need to sort out themselves. It was a struggle to go back, and I think people found it both frightening if they're concerned about ill health, but also unsatisfactory because we are a church that sings. And we were not allowed to sing when we first went back. We were separated, distanced from each other. Odd things like choirs were allowed to sing before congregations were allowed to sing. No one ever quite understood that one. So church wasn't what people expected, and yet a lot of us, I think, wanted just to get back out from our homes and see people. We weren't allowed to do our tea and coffee after the service. But so the congregations could then just cross the road and go to a cafe, which was allowed to do tea and coffee. That kind of dissonance between regulations, and I know there was this balance of Haram's argument, which gave it a kind of pseudo-scientific gloss, but it was very hard for us centrally to deal with people who saw that happening on the ground. So they couldn't have tea and coffee in the church, but they could go to the cafe or they could go to the pub. They could eat out there, but they couldn't have a biscuit with their friends in church. And so some of that missed each other. People were trying to do their best. I see that. I'm not apportioning blame, but it was a challenge to lead and to coordinate that activity across Scotland for us, and that's just how it was. I don't think we ever got back to normal. I think the habitual attenders learned and formed other habits on a Sunday. I know from speaking to Jewish friends that they found some of the similar experience, but we certainly did not. We lost attendees who habitually went to church on a Sunday and then who did other things on a Sunday when they weren't allowed to go to church. And I think that the experience of church is not what it was, where there is part on hybrid, where people who are not singing, who are watching, sitting on their sofa, and those who are in church. That's a challenge. The variation is quite marked across Scotland and across congregations, depending who they are, where they are, what they offer beyond Sunday, how engaged people are with community activity, and how much it is simply worship. So I couldn't give a detailed analysis of who's back to normal, but certainly as a denomination, we never got back to the attendance levels we had before, with obvious lack of impact, lack of income, and a breakdown of community connection that came with that. So, a lasting impact, but certainly a challenging time to coordinate and to changing rules, and to get changing rules on a Friday when church meets on a Sunday and it's run by volunteers. I would have hoped one lesson that government in any future thing would see to send the thing out on a Monday rather than that. So there's some mechanical stuff in there. But certainly conversations improved over the period, and we saw the impact of our discussions in the regulation changes, and then there was a dissonance where different sectors were treated differently for no doubt, for some people's mind, good reason, but it did create a difficulty in coordination and leading and telling people to obey, which wasn't there when it was simply a matter of being shut.
Thank you. And Mr. Afzal.
Thanks. Yeah, just to build on what the Honourable Dr White has said there, going back to the very start, I think just even getting to a point where we could reopen was a struggle. You had this bizarre situation where you could potentially go to a pub, but you couldn't go to a place of worship. I think the phrase that was coined by one of the members of Parliament was pints over prayers. And really there was this sense of, well, you know, why can we not go back to pray, given that there's such a disparity between why you would go to a pub and what you would do in a pub compared to why you would go to, for example, a mosque or a church and what you would be doing there. So actually even just getting to a point where we could reopen was a bit of a struggle, and it involved some quite heated meetings and intense pressure, certainly from our side, to allow that to happen. When we closed the mosques, it fell on myself to record the video to put out to the community to say that the mosques had closed. Within that video, we'd asked for mosques to step up and to actually support their communities through various outreach programmes and whatnot. Those volunteers that were involved with that, then all of a sudden they had to change and start to plan for the reopening of mosques. Across the UK, there was a small group of us who got together to put together guidance for reopening mosques, and what that looked like. And again, there was an instructional video that we'd done to show people what that would look like. Essentially, they would be coming into the mosque, they would be registering their details at the front of the mosque, and that was in case there was any infections, so we could tell people that there may have been contact. They were having to bring their own prayer mat, they were having to wear a face mask, they were not allowed to pray shoulder to shoulder, as is our manner of congregational prayer. We had to socially distance. What did help in that regard was one of the most senior imams in the world had released a video to show if you have to socially distance and pray in congregation, here's how you can do it. So that helped to give us an indication of how we could do that, socially distance and still pray in congregation in a way in which would be right for us. So then when we reopened and we had people coming for the congregational prayer, it was really a massive culture shock in terms of how we would then use that space in the mosque. So the times, for example, of when mosques were open was restricted as well. So mosques generally would have an open door policy. The timings were restricted, so it was pretty much half an hour before the congregational prayer, half an hour after, in some cases even less than that. In terms of the cap as well, you're going, from a situation where the mosques were pretty much at capacity on a Friday to a point where you're having to restrict people to 50. There's some mosques which had multiple congregations to try and help with that, but even with multiple congregations, you're scratching the surface of what a normal congregation would look like. So many people missed out. Elders at the start were told because of their age that they couldn't come to the mosque because they were a high risk, and in some cases that was the people who had actually founded the mosques, funded the mosques, and been integral to the running of the mosques in their early days. So to tell people like that, that they couldn't come to the mosque, then, again, this is where that sense of guilt that I mentioned earlier would come in. You're restricting who could come to the mosque. Children, it's an important part of their upbringing within their faith to come to the mosque, particularly from the age of 7 onwards, to learn to pray and to get used to the mosque environment. That couldn't happen either. Again, children were deemed as a high risk for spreading COVID. So they couldn't come to the mosque either. So although we did return to congregational worship in some form, it was very much reduced, and it was very much alien to what we were used to as a community. But just being able to actually get back into the mosques again and to have congregational prayer, it was some comfort though to the communities that could happen again.
Thank you. I'm just conscious of time. I have a few other questions. I'm going to combine a couple of my questions. If I could ask you to answer that, please, and then I'll leave a few minutes at the end for each of you to add anything else that you think is particularly important we've not covered. I wonder if, and maybe unusual topics to combine, but I wonder if you could tell me about the differences to funeral, observance of funerals and weddings in your faith, and perhaps touch on the impact of that on families and on the couple who had to delay their marriage. And if we could start with you, Dr. White, I think.
Yeah. Funerals were a real challenge, and even when restrictions were eased a little, they were in some ways more of a challenge. Clearly, as in most communities, funerals are by and large communal things where family and friends, neighbours come together to mourn their loss, draw the line in the sand, accept the fact that the person is dead, and begin the process of grieving. And that's common to human experience. Once you can't do that, and the person you used to associate with a lot, whom you can no longer see through lockdown, and then they die, then there's a strange grief process thing goes on there. And if you slightly before that, the care of people who are dying and who are near the end of their life was obviously very restricted as well. And you had heart-tugging things where people would speak in windows, people saying goodbye to their relatives on the phone. Clearly, that's not an ideal way to end life, to accept loss, to face loss. It felt wrong. It caused anxiety. It caused lasting scars on people who felt that they should have been there for their family. They should have been there for their friends. So that was a difficult thing, and we had to find ways of supporting people as best we could. We couldn't break the rules, but we could try and keep in touch. We could try and create online stuff that would allow people to mourn together. And that was always a challenge to try and regulate that. You could say there's only 6 people get into the crematorium and it would be broadcast online, and you'd find 100 people in the car park watching it on a phone. You'd say 6 or 10 people round a grave, but you'd find people round the grave and the other people on a path separate from it, and you had all the narkiness that came with that. The people wanted to be there. There is no other chance to mourn like that. So we missed out a lot, and I've no doubt for individuals that carried forward into their coping with loss and acceptance of loss. Weddings, as you probably know, have become more ornate, costlier, longer planned than they used to be. People seek out venues and so on. A lot rests on it. They're competitive is perhaps the wrong word, but people try to be individual. They design occasions, they have build-up things, stag nights, hen do's, which are no longer stag nights, they're stag weekends. There's a whole range of stuff that goes into planning, outfits, chair hires, whatever it is. There's an enormous thing that the wedding industry persuades people is essential. All that had to be curtailed, and the expectation of what a wedding looked like, this special dream occasion, had to be shrunk down to something that was much more restricted. And for those who had set their heart on a big wedding, a family occasion, the bringing together people from distances, all that vanished. And clearly there's loss in that. People no doubt save money in that, but it's a different kind of argument to the funeral one. It's an aspirational thing. It's an expectational thing. The funeral stuff is very core to who we are. and how we relate, and the loss of those things, the preparation for death, the grieving at death, and the immediate care of people afterwards, which had to be done at a distance or on the phone or on the video link, I think is much challenging and damaging probably than the wedding restriction thing, which no doubt for the individuals involved was trying. But I felt they felt different, but both had major impacts clearly through COVID.
Thank you. Mr. Afzal, I'm aware you commented on this in the previous session, but I wonder if there's anything that you'd like to expand on or add to your previous answer.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of funerals, we covered that quite extensively in the last session. In terms of weddings, just briefly, there's the actual kind of religious element of the wedding, and then there's all the cultural baggage that comes with the wedding, and it's important to separate the two out. So within the Islamic tradition, there's the nikah ceremony, which is the religious blessing. After that, there's a walima, which is a small reception, and that's all that there is from a religious perspective in terms of weddings. Everything else my honourable friend has already mentioned, applies with our community as well. Everything else is kind of a cultural consideration. But again, when it comes to the religious blessing, some couples would opt to have that in the mosque. So they would normally conjoin that with one of the prayers. So it might be, for example, after the Jummah prayer, and that would be because there'd be a lot of people who would be there at the time. They would take part in the blessing element. They would pray for the couple, that kind of thing, and they would distribute sweets and things to the congregation as well afterwards. You then had this situation where you had the various caps. So you maybe had a cap for 50 for congregational prayer, but then you were only allowed a certain number for a wedding ceremony. So how you managed that again, it created difficulties. It was the same situation with the funerals as well. As I mentioned in the last session, we conjoined the funeral prayer with the afternoon prayer here in Scotland for practical reasons, and then having to turn people away. When it came to the funerals, there's people who, and the funeral services team have mentioned this to me as well. There's people to this day who still bear a grudge against them for not allowing them to take part in the final rites of their loved ones. And similarly with weddings, many couples feel as though they didn't get that special occasion that they maybe would have gotten out with those restrictions. Again, it was a difficult situation to manage, but our emphasis was really on making sure that the religious blessing element of it could happen, and the walima and the small reception, that's part of the religious element, could happen in some form, whether that was just as a family in a home or something along those lines. That was the key focus for us. Everything else, as I say, would just be cultural.
Thank you. And Mr. Hutchinson.
I would echo much of what's just been said, with some exceptions. As we're such a small body, we in fact had very few funerals and no weddings during the lockdown and restricted periods. But the funerals were the difficulty. The few that we did have did cause enormous grief to the families concerned. It didn't really impact on the Quaker element, other than the service was under Quaker auspices, and that was perhaps the most difficult part of the pandemic for us, even with such small numbers. With other funerals it was easier. One was woodland, so we're all outside anyway, and that made things much easier. In both funerals and in weddings, the Quaker practice is to have a normal meeting for worship with some additions. So the weddings would have been in that form and are quite simple. And those that were about to come were put off until it was possible to have them. So I think that's all I need to say now.
Thank you. And finally, we have 5 minutes, so I want to, although I have other questions, I'd prefer to give you an opportunity to highlight any points that you think are particularly relevant for his lordship to hear from you on. So I'd like to ask that you now use that opportunity. If we could start with you, Mr. Afzal.
Sure. I think when we were talking about the kind of technological solutions to things, whether it's queuing systems or whatnot, or broadcasting acts of worship, I think digital exclusion was an issue, particularly with some of the elder members of our congregations, and being able to access technology to be able to even get book a space to come for congregational prayer. That was an issue. The experiences that asylum seekers had was a massive one, particularly for members of congregations in certain parts of the country. And I think if it's not already on your roster, I would say that taking evidence from the likes of the Scottish Refugee Council would be incredibly important for the inquiry.
I think we've already done that, actually.
You've done that, okay, excellent. And also in the way in which CAPs were actually managed, we put forward plans to be able to use that 50 cap in multiple halls on the same site where there are separate entrances and exits, where it would have been safe for different cohorts of 50 to pray within the congregation, within the different halls in the mosque. That was repeatedly pushed back on from the government. I think that would have helped, certainly in terms of our numbers. And in terms of travel restrictions as well, and tiers, not everybody would want to go to what is their immediately local mosque, maybe because it's not the mosque that's part of their tradition. So they may have wanted to travel to a mosque which is out with their restriction zone. So again, that would have put up some barriers for people being able to access places of worship during the lockdown and subsequently when places of worship opened.
Thank you. And Mr. Hutchinson.
I think the one area which I'd like to mention is the financial impact. We're still struggling with that now because of loss of income where we hired out premises, particularly in the larger buildings such as here in Edinburgh. And elsewhere, it had effect on our national, that is UK staff levels, and we're still grappling with some of that. There are also sub-parts of that. For example, in Glasgow, we subsidise lettings to what we call the anonymous groups, 5 of them, such as Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's one of the few places they can afford to rent. And of course that stopped for quite some time, so it disrupted people who use our premises as well as ourselves, perhaps even more so than ourselves. The only other thing I'd like to mention is that my perception is that quite a lot of the impact of the pandemic was really exacerbating social trends that were already happening and made us either adapt, such as in video conferencing, which isn't ideal but brings community together, or rather like was mentioned earlier with the Church of Scotland, that we have lost some groups of people, although now we're getting many more back because of the world situation.
Thank you. And Dr. White.
I think the early lesson was that that the churches, the faith groups, had no real relationship with the Scottish Government and its civil service. The conversations were sometimes reasonably amusing in terms of terminology and misunderstanding, and we were not therefore geared up to speak to each other about difficult subjects, even to talk in the same terms. And there was clearly a lack of awareness of just how much community space, facility, interaction that religious groups have and put into Scottish life. That improved during the time, but it was a dissonance at the start. There's no doubt about that. I think along the way, the other challenges, there's no point in repeating things, but the stuff that where different sectors were treated differently to faith groups was a very difficult thing to manage. I think also the challenge of operating premises with a volunteer decision-making trustee processes as opposed to managing a licensed premises, say. To treat us all on the same pitch and with the same pace of change was a challenge for us, and we certainly lost a fair number of local office bearers who simply could not cope with the responsibilities they now perceived that they had. They probably always had, of course, but the challenge of maintaining that shook out from our system a core of volunteers, which has been a challenge to recover from. So a better understanding of each other and a better knowledge in better times would be a good thing. Within the faith groups, probably, and the importance of knowing each other and in good times, and doing some of the prep should disaster occur again would be useful. And I think for all of us, just a sense that we are slowly but surely working away at becoming an organisation, a faith group that works within a world of mixed ways of attending, and we will never quite be the same. None of us will be the same after the COVID.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, my Lord.
Thank you, Ms. Barama. And all that remains is me is thank you, gentlemen. I've listened with interest over a really relatively short period of time, 3 days this week, to evidence from faith groups, religious organisations, and it really has been quite interesting. And some of the things you said at the end there struck a chord, I have to say. The dissonance or lack of knowledge by government and about faith groups, possibly, and my thoughts are in a rather incoherent and early state, possibly a result of a very quick movement, even in my relatively short 70 years on this earth, from a society which had a fairly strong connection with religious life, an essentially secular society, has happened really very quickly when all is said and done. And that is perhaps the reason why there has been that lack of communication between the two groups, and that is something that should probably be thought about. I certainly will give it thought.
Yeah.
So thank you for opening my eyes or my mind to that. I'm very grateful. That is all for today. And we're back. Let me check again. Tomorrow morning it's crumbs. It's 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Excellent. Second time this week we've managed that. At 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Thank you all.